Did I ask you to touch that piano? The teacher's voice cracked through the auditorium like a whip. Naomi froze, hands still resting gently on the polished keys, cloth in the other. She wasn't playing. Just cleaning. Just the janitor. That's all they ever saw. But what he didn't know was that Naomi's hands had once moved crowds to tears. That those same fingers had danced across keys before the world forced her into silence. And what no one expected was that this quiet woman had been carrying a lifetime of music, waiting, aching, ready. What followed would become one of the most powerful awakenings the Academy and the world would ever witness. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now, let's get back to the story. Did I ask you to touch that piano? The words cracked through the silent auditorium like a whip, sharp enough to make Naomi flinch. Her hand, weathered and calloused from decades of labor, froze just inches above the glossy black keys. She had merely been wiping away a smudge of dust, instinctively, reverently. But now her fingers curled back, as though burned, retreating from an accusation they didn't deserve. Mr. Halbridge stood at the edge of the stage, his expensive shoes echoing as he strode forward with indignation painted across his narrow face. His sharp gray suit hung on his tall frame like armor, his eyes cold, fixed on the older woman still standing beside the grand piano. "I wasn't playing, sir," Naomi said softly, her voice almost drowned by the vastness of the hall. "You weren't asked to clean the piano either," he snapped. "Your job is to mop the floors, not meddle with the Steinway. That instrument costs more than your yearly salary." Several students seated in the front row turned their heads, some smirking, others averting their eyes. No one spoke. The silence felt complicit, heavy with quiet judgment. Naomi lowered her gaze. She didn't want trouble. She had come early, as she always did, long before the students filled the practice halls and recital rooms with their expensive shoes and bored expressions. The auditorium had been empty, the piano alone under the skylight where the morning sun warmed its polished lid. And something in her, a trembling echo of something long buried, had drawn her toward it. But she should have known better. People like her didn't belong in places like this. Not really. Not in any way that mattered. "Understood," Naomi murmured, folding the cloth and tucking it into her cleaning cart. Halbridge exhaled sharply through his nose, like a man who had just chased off a stray. He turned on his heel and barked toward the students. "From the top, and this time, try not to butcher Debussy." The rehearsals resumed with the scraping sound of benches sliding and music stands clanking into place. But Naomi had already backed into the shadows, her quiet footsteps vanishing behind the velvet curtain. She didn't cry. Not yet. Not there. Behind the stage, past the rows of forgotten storage trunks and dusty light rigs, Naomi parked her cart and pressed her back to the cold cinderblock wall. Her breath came out in small, shallow puffs. She wasn't humiliated because he'd yelled. She was used to that. The world had been loud with men like Halbridge for as long as she could remember. It was something else, something older. The way her hand had hovered over the keys, almost trembling with desire. The ghost of a chord rising in her chest before it was snuffed out. She remembered it the same way one remembers a smell. Warm summer rain on pavement, the pages of sheet music yellowed by time. She had once known that world, long ago. Before bills, before working 2 jobs, before dreams became luxury items. Naomi touched her left wrist with her right hand, pressing down gently where old pain once flared from hours of practice. That wrist had known Rachmaninoff, knew the ache of perfection, the hunger for beauty, but all that had been left behind like a closed book. It had to be. "Hey!" Naomi looked up sharply. A girl, no older than 15, peeked around the curtain, pale skin, frizzy red ponytail, and curious hazel eyes. She held a music binder clutched against her chest. "Sorry if I scared you," the girl said, stepping closer. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop." Naomi straightened. "You didn't scare me. Shouldn't you be in rehearsal?" The girl shrugged. "Maestro Halbridge kicked me out, said I was rushing the left hand again." Naomi gave a tired smile. "Well, rushing the left hand is a dangerous habit. Gets you in trouble with Chopin and teachers alike." The girl blinked. "Wait, how'd you know?" "I have ears, child," Naomi said and started pushing her cart, but the girl stepped beside her. You weren't really playing earlier, were you? Naomi stopped. No, she said. I was cleaning. The girl tilted her head. It looked like more than that. Naomi gave her a long, unreadable look, then offered a small nod and continued walking, the wheels of her cart squeaking faintly as she disappeared into the side hall. Later that evening, long after the last echoes of scales and arpeggios had faded from the academy's stone walls, Naomi lingered. The building was silent again. Hollow. She moved slowly through the corridors, turning off lights, closing doors, resetting chairs the way she always did. But tonight she paused in the auditorium again. The piano sat waiting beneath the skylight, bathed in silver-blue moonlight now. The shadows were softer, and the air carried the scent of varnish, old wood, and memory. Naomi walked to the bench. She didn't sit, she simply ran her fingertips across the edge of the keys. Ivory. Cool. Familiar in a way that hurt. You don't belong here, she whispered, not to herself, but to the voice inside her that dared to still believe. Yet the keys called to her. She sat down slowly. The lid creaked as she opened it, exposing the strings and hammers like a wound freshly uncovered. She placed her hands on the keys. Not to clean this time. To remember. She played just a few measures. Quiet, intimate. The first lines of a lullaby she had written at 17, back when she dreamed of Juilliard, before her mother got sick, before she had to leave school and work 2 jobs to keep the lights on. The notes rose like ghosts in the empty room. And she wasn't the janitor anymore. Not for those brief, trembling moments. She was Naomi Williams, the girl who once made judges weep, who once played so passionately she cracked a string during a competition and didn't stop until the final note. She didn't hear the soft gasp behind the curtain. Didn't know that Lila, the same red-haired girl, had returned, unable to stop thinking about her. Didn't know that a video, secretly recorded in the dark, would soon travel farther than she ever had. All she knew was the piano, and the way it remembered her. The auditorium was supposed to be empty. At least, that's what Lila told herself when her fingers pushed gently against the backstage door, allowing it to creak open just wide enough for her to peer through the gap. She hadn't meant to come back. Not really. Her mother was probably already calling, and her violin case still lay forgotten in the student lounge. But something about the janitor's voice, Naomi's voice, had stuck in her ears. The way she said, rushing the left hand. Not condescending, not mocking. Just knowing. It was the way her music teacher at summer camp used to speak. The way people talk when they're not guessing but remembering. And now, hidden in the wings behind the heavy velvet curtains, Lila stood in the shadows, her breath caught in her throat. What she saw on stage wasn't a janitor. Naomi sat upright, her spine elegant, her fingers curved with natural precision over the ivory keys. She wasn't just playing, she was conversing with the piano. Her hands whispered truths in a language the strings knew by heart. The music didn't demand attention with fast, flashy runs or crashing chords. It was quieter than that, deeper, as though someone had taken sorrow and wrapped it in lace. Lila didn't recognize the piece. It wasn't Chopin or Liszt or anything they drilled into her during studio class. It felt older, yet more personal. It sounded like a lullaby, but not for a child, for something lost long ago. Each note lingered longer than it needed to, daring the silence to interrupt. Naomi's eyes were closed. Her face, half lit by the skylight, was still, not smiling, not frowning, just suspended. It was a face Lila didn't know she needed to see, one that looked like quiet survival, like someone who used to dream and never completely stopped. And then, without warning, the music ceased. Not with a flourish or a final resolve. Just stopped. Naomi's hands fell to her lap. Her breath hitched ever so slightly, as though she had awakened from a dream too beautiful to last. She sat there in stillness for a long time before gently closing the lid. Lila backed away before she could be seen, her heart thudding like a timpani. She didn't want to get Naomi in trouble again, but more than that, she didn't want Naomi to know she had been seen. Not yet. Outside, the cool night air nipped at Lila's cheeks as she finally stepped into the courtyard. Her ride home would be silent, but her mind wasn't. The song still hummed inside her ribcage, haunting and unplaceable. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because of practice stress or because of her usual pre-recital nerves, but because of Naomi's hands, the elegance in her posture, the grace. It was impossible, unless Naomi had been trained, not casually, not by ear, not as a hobby. No, this was something else, something deliberate, professional, maybe even world-class. The next day at the academy, Lila couldn't focus. During chamber class, she missed her cue twice. Halbridge was particularly snide. "Miss Carter, are you with us, or composing symphonies in your head again?" He mocked as the room tittered. But she didn't even hear him. Her mind was too full of what she'd seen, or rather, what she'd heard. During lunch, while students scrolled through phones and complained about finger strain and teacher favoritism, Lila sat alone, scribbling notes on her theory workbook, and not musical ones. These were observations, questions, played original composition, intuitive phrasing, advanced dynamic control. Hands equals small tremor in right wrist. Old injury? She didn't know what she was planning. She only knew that what Naomi had done the night before, alone, in the dark, deserved to be heard. And so that evening, after most students had left and the faculty were in a meeting, Lila returned to the auditorium, this time prepared. She brought her phone. Not to record secretly again, but in hopes Naomi might return to play once more. She waited, hidden in the same backstage nook. 10 minutes passed, then 20, but the piano remained untouched, the lid closed like a coffin. Lila's heart sank. Maybe Naomi had sensed her presence. Maybe she'd never return. She sighed and stood up to leave, but then heard it. The faint sound of footsteps, steady, measured. Naomi entered the stage from the side, her posture heavy with fatigue. Her cart was gone. She wasn't wearing her janitor uniform tonight, just a long dark coat and a scarf tied tightly around her neck. She looked both regal and tired, like a queen who'd spent her day disguised among commoners. She paused in front of the piano, eyes lingering on it. This time she didn't sit right away. She ran her hand gently across the lid, like someone touching an old photograph. Lila's hands trembled slightly as she raised her phone and hit record. Naomi sat and began. This time it was different. No lullaby, no hesitation. It started with an ascending scale, sharp and urgent, then melted into a flowing cascade of seventh chords and modulated keys. The piece was complex, dangerously so. The kind of work that would have taken a conservatory student months to learn. But Naomi didn't read sheet music, didn't pause. The music lived in her body. It was defiant, bold, and heartbreakingly beautiful. When it ended, Lila stopped recording. Her hands were damp with sweat, her mouth dry. It felt like witnessing a miracle. She ran out before Naomi could see her. That night, she uploaded the video anonymously. No face, just the caption, "The hidden genius of the janitor, listen until the end." She didn't expect much, maybe a few shares, a few stunned reactions, but by morning her phone had over 2,000 notifications. The video had exploded, shared on Reddit, Twitter, Instagram. Musicians and celebrities commented things like, "I just cried in my kitchen." This is what music means. Not competition, not fame, soul. I'd pay to hear her live. Some asked for her name. Some guessed she was a ghost pianist or a forgotten legend. Others compared her touch to Nina Simone or Clara Haskell. At school, murmurs spread like wildfire. "Did you see that janitor video? She's here? Here? At our school?" No way that's real. It sounds edited. Halbridge overheard one such conversation in the hallway and scoffed. "More internet drivel," he said dismissively. "People are so easily impressed." But later that afternoon, the headmaster summoned him into her office. "Philip," she said curtly, pushing her glasses higher onto her nose, "have you seen this?" She turned her laptop toward him and pressed play. Naomi's music filled the room, and Halbridge went very still. He recognized the acoustics, the lighting, the piano, and the woman. His face darkened. "That video must be taken down immediately," he said. But the headmaster raised her hand. "Too late. It's already been syndicated across several platforms. We've had inquiries from donors, press outlets, even Juilliard. They want to know who she is." Halbridge's jaw clenched. "She's our janitor." The headmaster leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Is she?" Naomi didn't know she had gone viral. She moved through the corridors the same way she always had. Quiet, invisible, efficient. Her cart clinked faintly with cleaning supplies as she polished the brass banisters and emptied the student lounge bins. If any of the students stared longer than usual, she chalked it up to idle curiosity. If someone whispered and quickly looked away, she assumed it was because they thought she smelled of floor polish. She didn't own a smartphone. Her world wasn't one of apps and notifications, but of routines. Predictable, quiet, safe. Still, she felt something had changed. The way students stood up a little straighter when she entered a room. The way a few teachers gave her curt nods instead of ignoring her entirely. It was subtle. But change always started that way. Soft, like the first raindrop before the storm. And then came the meeting. It was on a Tuesday morning. Naomi was scrubbing the baseboards outside the staff lounge when the headmaster herself approached, something that had never happened in all of Naomi's years at the academy. "Miss Williams?" the headmaster said, her voice clipped but not unkind. Naomi rose slowly, unsure whether she was being reprimanded or mistaken for someone else. "Yes, ma'am? Could I have a word with you? In my office?" A sentence like that had the weight of a verdict. Naomi wiped her hands on her apron and followed, each footstep echoing louder in her mind than in the hallway. The headmaster's office was polished oak and glass, lined with silver-framed awards and sepia-toned photographs of founders long dead. Naomi stood in the center, feeling the space close around her like velvet jaws. The headmaster gestured to a chair. "Please." Naomi sat. Carefully. A long pause followed. Then the headmaster clicked on her monitor, turned it slightly, and pressed play. Naomi heard the first few bars of the piece she'd played. Her fingers twitched involuntarily in her lap. She hadn't known anyone had recorded it. The realization hit like cold water. She reached up and removed her glasses. I didn't mean, I wasn't trying to." The headmaster lifted a hand. "You don't have to explain. That video, Miss Williams, it's extraordinary. You've been trending for nearly 36 hours, over 8 million views." Naomi stared. The numbers meant nothing. The idea of being watched, heard, exposed, that meant everything. "I'm just the janitor," she said softly, her voice barely a breath. The headmaster leaned forward. "Are you? Because we've had 4 different institutions call this morning asking for your name. People think you're a long-lost virtuoso or a ghost pianist who vanished decades ago. Carnegie Hall's director personally emailed me to ask who you are." Naomi swallowed. Her chest felt tight. She'd spent decades trying to not be seen. Now suddenly the world wanted to look at her. "I didn't mean for anyone to hear it," she said. "That was private." The headmaster didn't press. She only nodded slowly, then reached for a manila folder on her desk. "We'd like to invite you to perform at our spring honors recital. It would be the final performance of the night. A centerpiece." Naomi blinked. "You want me to play?" "Yes. If you're willing." This school was founded to uplift talent, all talent. Naomi almost laughed, a bitter, disbelieving sound. "You've had me clean bathrooms for 10 years. The only thing anyone's ever lifted here was a mop out of my hands." A flush of discomfort rose in the headmaster's cheeks. Sometimes institutions forget their own values, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to correct our course. Naomi looked down. Her fingers were trembling. "I don't even know if I can still perform like that again." The headmaster opened the folder. "You can take time. We'll give you access to the recital hall at night. No restrictions." Naomi shook her head. "And what happens after? When the applause dies down? I go back to cleaning the bathrooms?" Silence. Not heavy, just honest. The headmaster closed the folder gently. "That's up to you." Naomi stood. Her hands gripped the back of the chair for balance. "I need to think." "Of course." As Naomi stepped out into the hallway, students parted for her. Some offered soft smiles. 1 or 2 even clapped gently as she passed. It unnerved her more than the headmaster's offer. She went home that night to her tiny apartment above a laundromat. The walls were thin, the heat slow to rise. She sat at her old upright piano, its keys yellowed and some sticking, and tried to play. Her hands remembered, but they also hurt. Still, the music came. Not easily, but it came. The next night, Naomi returned to the auditorium. Not to clean, but to sit at the Steinway again. This time, she brought with her an old, battered sheet of music, her own composition, handwritten when she was just 22, a piece no one had ever heard. A requiem, she once called it. For what, she didn't even remember anymore. She sat down, took a breath, and played. From the hallway, Lila watched through the glass doors. She hadn't told anyone she was the one who recorded the video. She wasn't sure if she ever would. But she watched Naomi's fingers glide with solemn power, and she smiled. Back in the staff wing, Halbridge scrolled through his phone angrily. The video was now at 10 million views. His jaw clenched. He knew the way the public worked. 1 minute a star, the next minute forgotten. This was a phase, a moment. That woman didn't have the stamina for real performance anymore. She was all emotion and no discipline. She didn't deserve the academy stage, not after everything he'd built, clawed, earned. He turned to his computer and began typing an email to the board. Subject, spring recital program, urgent reconsideration. He would not go down quietly. Not for a janitor. Not for a mistake. The auditorium smelled different at night, not of the usual sharp polish or dust kicked up from rehearsals, but of something older, sweeter, like mahogany soaked in time. Naomi stepped onto the stage again slowly, her footsteps muffled by the velvet hush of the empty hall. Each night she returned, it felt less like trespassing and more like reclaiming something lost, something sacred. She brought no audience, no spotlight, no fanfare, only silence. And silence, in its strange and reverent way, always listened. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not quite ready to press. She had never feared playing, only being seen playing. Because once people knew you had a gift, they expected something of you. They demanded it, and then, eventually, they judged it. That's what frightened her. But music? Music had never betrayed her. She began with slow, intentional notes, unbraiding the theme she'd carried in her mind for decades. Not scales, not someone else's masterpieces. Just her own. Little melodies she once scribbled on torn pages, composed while riding buses late at night after long shifts, tapping rhythms into her legs while standing in grocery lines she could barely afford. She didn't play to impress, she played to survive. By the second evening, she was bringing her full composition, the one she never dared submit to any competition. It had no name. She always called it the piece that waited. Waited, perhaps, for this exact moment. But the music did more than wait. It reached, it unfolded into the vast space like a confession. The harmonies wept and rose, layered with tension and release, as if the piano itself were remembering what it was meant for. Naomi's back straightened. Her hands didn't hesitate anymore. They knew the terrain, even after all these years. It was her soul, after all, that had written the path. Unbeknownst to her, the security guard had begun leaving the lights on a little longer. He didn't say anything. He just sat in the back row and listened, cap in hand, eyes misting. One night he brought his wife. Another night, a cellist who used to teach there before retiring. Word spread, softly and reverently, like a hymn through a chapel. Naomi never knew. She left before the lights fully dimmed every time. She wasn't ready to face anyone yet. But others were ready. Down the hallway, students had begun sneaking into the far balcony, sitting in quiet rows, hearts pressed to the notes that drifted upward like smoke. They didn't film this time, they just listened. Each night the crowd grew, and each night Naomi remained unaware. Until one evening she stood after playing, turned, and saw them. Dozens. No applause, no gasps, just silence, reverent and warm. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. She simply nodded once, quietly, and left the stage. But that night, she didn't walk away with trembling hands. That night, she felt tall again. She returned to her small apartment and took down the old framed photograph on the wall. It was worn, corners curling, the colors faded to the past. A young Naomi stood between her parents, beaming, holding a certificate from the State Youth Symphony, first place in composition. Her mother wore a flowered scarf. Her father's arm was wrapped around her like a shield. She whispered to the picture, "I'm still playing, Mama." Across town, in a studio lined with gold records and velvet soundproof walls, a woman sat at a desk watching Naomi's now legendary video for the 4th time. Isabel Cho, pianist, philanthropist, global concert icon. She didn't watch with the clinical detachment most prodigies do. No, she leaned in closer, watching every keystroke like a prayer, every rest like a breath stolen from grief. When the video ended, Isabel wiped a tear from her cheek and picked up her phone. "Get me the director of Melrose Academy now." 2 days later, the call came. Naomi was in the middle of wiping chalk fingerprints off the whiteboard in the theory classroom when the headmaster stepped in. "There's someone who'd like to speak with you." Naomi turned, puzzled. A woman stood behind her, tall, elegant, with silver-threaded black hair and presence that could hush a storm. "I'm Isabel Cho," she said gently, "and I watched you play." Naomi blinked. "Ma'am, I think you may be mistaken." "I'm not," Isabel said, I'm a musician. I know what genius looks like, especially the kind that's been hidden under dust for far too long. Naomi didn't know what to say. I'm hosting a benefit concert in 2 weeks, Isabel continued, for underserved music programs. I want you to play as my headliner. Naomi's knees felt weak. I'm not a performer anymore, she whispered. You are, Isabel said. You just forgot how it feels to be seen. I'm not ready. I'll help you be. Naomi's voice cracked. What if I fail? Isabel reached out and took her hand. Then fail in front of the world, but let them know you were here. That night, Naomi didn't practice alone. Isabel sat beside her in the empty recital hall. She offered no instructions, no critique, only presence. You don't need to fix a thing, she said after Naomi played her original piece. It's not broken, it's yours. By the third night of rehearsal, even Halbridge couldn't deny it. He stood outside the door listening, arms crossed. He didn't enter, couldn't. His pride held him back like chains. But his silence for once was not authority, it was defeat. The Academy's bulletin board was updated. Spring recital final performance, Naomi Williams, original composition. Some faculty objected, quietly, bitterly. But the students, they were thrilled. Because finally, someone who looked like their grandmother, someone who had mopped their floors and cleaned their spilled coffee, was taking the stage not with apology, but with power. And power, when it arrives gently, lasts longer. Why are you so afraid of her playing? The question shattered the air like glass. Halbridge turned sharply. Lila Carter stood alone in the hallway, arms crossed over her music folder, her voice steadier than her heart. The corridor outside the recital prep room was lined with oil portraits of composers, but at that moment, the most piercing gaze came from a 15-year-old girl who'd had enough. I beg your pardon, he said, cold and clipped. I said, why are you so scared of Miss Naomi playing? She repeated, chin lifted, tone unwavering. Because you are. I've seen it in your face. Halbridge's jaw tensed. I'm not scared of a custodian pretending to be a pianist. She's not pretending, Lila replied. You are. The silence between them expanded. You parade your credentials, your education, your awards, but you never play. Not once have you sat at that piano and played for us. Not since I've been here, she said, eyes narrowing. Maybe you're not scared she's unqualified. Maybe you're scared she's better. Halbridge's nostrils flared, and for a moment Lila thought he might explode. But instead, he did what cowards often do. He sneered. You know nothing about this industry. About discipline, about legacy. What she has is sentimentality, not substance. We do not reward sentiment in classical music. We reward excellence. She is excellence, Lila snapped. But you were too proud to see it. She turned and walked away before he could respond. Her pulse was racing, her palms were slick, but inside something unshakable had settled. She had spoken truth, and once spoken, truth did not unspeak itself. In the days that followed, Naomi's story spread beyond the Academy's gates. An article appeared in the New York Times. The janitor who plays like a dream, Naomi Williams and the music she hid from the world. NPR followed, then local news, then a short feature on Good Morning America. But Naomi, humble to her core, declined interviews. She didn't want to be a spectacle. She only wanted to be allowed to play. The night before the spring honors recital, Naomi stood backstage staring at the curtain. The auditorium was packed, more packed than it had ever been for any previous concert. Alumni returned. Donors filled the front row. Isabel Cho sat beside a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer. Cameras had been permitted, but only 2. The rest were told to watch, not capture. Naomi wore a floor-length indigo gown gifted by Isabel. Her hair was pulled into a soft bun, streaks of silver like moonlight woven through. Her fingers twitched. Are you nervous? Lila whispered, sneaking up beside her with a bottle of water. Naomi smiled faintly. Terrified. Good, Lila said. Means you care. Naomi chuckled quietly. Do you always talk to elders like this? Only the legendary ones, Lila replied, her eyes twinkling. The stage lights shifted. The announcer stepped to the microphone and said, For the final performance of the evening, please welcome a woman whose story and sound has moved the world, Ms. Naomi Williams. Applause swelled like a wave. Naomi stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then she stepped forward. The light was blinding at first. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces. There was Halbridge, sitting stiffly at the far side, arms folded tightly. There were students, dozens of them, on their feet before she even reached the bench. She sat, and silence fell. It wasn't the silence of anticipation, it was reverence. Naomi placed her hands on the keys. She didn't announce the piece, didn't bow, didn't smile. She began. The first notes rang like bells, clean, melancholy, unapologetic. Then the harmonies deepened, textures weaving like threads of silk and smoke. Her music told a story that had no words but all the emotion of a lifetime, of girlhood promise cut short, of love lost, of dreams denied, of years bent over mops and brooms while symphonies roared behind her ribs. People leaned forward, breath held. The second movement swelled with grief. There were no lyrics, but everyone heard them. A mother's soft hum on a kitchen floor, the crumple of eviction notices, the shatter of a broken wrist after a fall on a wet tile, the silence of dreams when rent was due. Then, a key change, sudden, bold. The music surged like a woman rising from her knees. Faster now, triumphant. This was not a victim's song. It was a warrior's. Naomi's fingers blurred. Her face remained still, eyes half closed, lost in a space between memory and power. She became the music. By the final cadence, every person in the audience had forgotten where they were. They were no longer in a recital hall. They were in Naomi's life, her triumph, her pain, her transcendence. She struck the final chord. It echoed for what felt like eternity. Then came the silence, and then eruption. The room exploded, not in polite applause, in tears, cheers, stomping feet, shouts of her name, strangers embracing. Naomi stood, bowed once, twice. Isabel Cho was crying. Lila was sobbing. Even the headmaster had a hand over her mouth. Halbridge remained seated, until, slowly, the realization that he alone was sitting pressed on him like weight. He stood and clapped once, then again. And though it may have been forced, it was the loudest sound he had ever made in support of another human being. Naomi walked off stage as though floating. Lila ran into her arms. "You did it," she whispered. Naomi held her tight. "We did." Outside, reporters waited. Music critics, bloggers, agents. They all wanted quotes, but Naomi said only this: "I didn't come here to be discovered. I came to remember who I was." That night, the Academy halls echoed with more than music. They echoed with transformation, and it had started with a girl who listened behind a curtain and a woman who refused to let time silence her song. The sky was still ink-dark when Naomi walked into the school the next morning. Her hands ached, not from pain, but from the ghost of the keys still pulsing through her fingertips. Even in the silence of dawn, the echoes of last night's standing ovation clung to the walls like perfume, as though the music had soaked into the very bones of the building. She hadn't slept. Her phone, an old flip model that barely held a charge, was now filled with unheard voicemails. Her mailbox at the Academy's side entrance, once empty save for routine maintenance checklists, overflowed with letters, cards, and notes handwritten by students, faculty, even former janitors who had heard her story. Some thanked her for the music. Others thanked her for proving that it was never too late. Many simply said, "You reminded me of who I used to be." But Naomi hadn't returned this morning for accolades. She'd returned for the piano. She stepped into the empty auditorium before the sun breached the high arched windows. The stage lights were off. No cameras. No clapping. Just her and the Steinway. She ran her hand across the closed lid. The piano felt different now. Not like an artifact in a place she wasn't allowed to touch, but like a partner, a co-conspirator. Last night, they had spoken together, and the world had finally listened. But it wasn't the listening that moved her. It was the release, the decades of music, grief, memory, and longing finally having space to breathe. She sat again. No audience, no pressure. She played the quiet version of her piece, the one she never performed, only whispered to herself in late hours after cleaning bathrooms, the version that mourned her mother's passing, the version that remembered the rust-colored couch where she once practiced scales while her father fell asleep reading the paper. The version filled not with rage or triumph, but with gratitude. Because even when everything had been taken from her, music remained. Her fingers moved slowly over the keys, each note a prayer. Behind her, the auditorium doors creaked open. She stopped playing. Naomi turned. It was Halbridge. He stood there, not in his usual sharp-pressed suit, but in a rumpled wool coat, the collar turned awkwardly, like a man who hadn't slept either. His hands were in his pockets, his face unreadable. "I figured I'd find you here," he said. Naomi said nothing. "I listened last night," he continued. "Every note." Still, she stayed silent. She wasn't going to make this easier for him. I was wrong, he said finally. Naomi blinked. The sentence seemed to cost him something real. I was wrong to dismiss you, wrong to silence you, wrong to assume you didn't belong. She studied him carefully. There was no smugness, no calculation, just wariness, maybe shame. You weren't the first, she said softly. I hope I'll be the last, he replied. She looked away, her fingers brushing the keys again. A single, slow arpeggio drifted upward between them. Halbridge stepped closer to the stage, but not onto it. He wouldn't dare. I started teaching here to prove I could shape great musicians, he said. But somewhere along the line, I stopped hearing the music. I started hearing resumes, auditions, accolades. You stopped listening with your heart, Naomi murmured, almost to herself. He nodded. And you reminded me how. Another silence stretched between them. But this one didn't feel tense. It felt open. I know an apology doesn't undo what I said or how I treated you. No, it doesn't, she said calmly. But the silence afterwards says more. He swallowed. I'd like to help fund a scholarship, in your name, for students like you, students the system overlooks. Naomi looked at him, genuinely surprised. Call it penance, he said. Call it legacy. I just want to start getting it right. She didn't respond right away. Then, slowly, she rose and stepped down from the stage, her feet light but certain. Make it a program, she said. Not just a scholarship, an entire initiative for hidden talent, for overlooked genius. Let's not wait until the world finds them to believe in them. His eyes widened slightly. I'll bring it to the board, he said. They'll listen. After last night, they'll listen to you. Naomi gave him the softest nod. She turned and began walking up the aisle toward the doors. But as she passed him, she stopped. You were wrong, she said. But thank you for saying it out loud. Then she left. Halbridge stood alone in the auditorium for a long time after she disappeared. He looked up at the grand piano on stage, the instrument that had always been his symbol of authority. Now it stood as a monument to humility. Later that week, flyers went up across the academy. The Naomi Williams Initiative, Discovering Greatness in the Unseen. The program launched with full faculty approval and generous donations pouring in from alumni who had seen her performance. It welcomed not only musicians but poets, dancers, painters, and students from underfunded schools, homeless shelters, and foster care programs. Naomi herself would oversee the auditions, but she never looked at grades or resumes. Only raw expression. Heart. Honesty. And those students, they played. With trembling hands, with flawed technique, with cracked voices. But they played the way Naomi had taught them, with everything. Naomi became more than a symbol. She became a mentor, a guide, a quiet revolution. Still, she kept her old cart, cleaned when she wanted to, not because she had to, but because she found comfort in it, and because some students still confided in her best when she was sweeping, not sitting behind a desk. One afternoon, she found a note taped to the piano lid. Dear Miss Naomi, you taught me that it's okay to be small and still be powerful. Thank you for showing me what music really means. Love, Leela. Naomi folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. She looked at the empty bench, then sat. This time, she didn't play her piece. She played Leela's. A simple little melody the girl had been working on for weeks. Naomi had heard her humming it softly in practice rooms, unsure of its worth. Now, Naomi played it like it belonged in a cathedral. She didn't just play music anymore. She played people's truths. And in that, she had become more than a pianist. She had become a mirror for every soul that had been overlooked. The following weeks unfolded like pages in a long-forgotten score finally being read aloud. Naomi moved through the academy halls with a new rhythm. Not hurried or cautious, but deliberate. Where once she had folded into the shadows like part of the wallpaper, now the world seemed to make space for her. Not out of pity, not even reverence, but respect. Real, earned, soul-deep respect. Students paused when they passed her, not to gawk, not to whisper, but to offer nods, greetings, thanks. One boy with shaggy hair and trembling hands caught her outside the music theory room. He looked like he'd rehearsed his words 100 times and still stumbled when they came out. I used to think I didn't belong here, he said. Then I saw you play. Naomi smiled gently. Now you know better. He nodded too quickly, like someone holding back tears. You do belong, she added softly. Music doesn't belong to institutions. It belongs to feelings. You've got those, don't you? He laughed through a sniffle. Too many. Good, Naomi said. That's where it starts. The Naomi Williams initiative began quietly. No red carpet, no ribbon cutting, just a stack of application forms, an unlocked practice room, and a sign taped to the door. If you love music, come play. No resume needed. And they came. From neighborhoods too often ignored, from families without funds for lessons, from schools that barely had working instruments. They came with borrowed shoes, cracked violin cases, keyboards with missing keys. They came afraid. And Naomi welcomed them all. She listened with her eyes closed, not because she was judging, but because she was feeling. She didn't interrupt, she didn't correct, she just let the music speak. When a shy girl named Ava played a hesitant lullaby on an out-of-tune flute, Naomi smiled through the sour notes. Did you write that? Ava nodded, cheeks pink. It sounded like sunlight through rain, Naomi said. Ava looked up in disbelief. Really? Really? Naomi didn't hand out scores, she handed out belief, and belief, it turned out, was contagious. Students who had once competed ruthlessly began mentoring the new ones. Studio doors once kept closed were propped open as older pupils offered sheet music, finger placements, breathing tips. Halbridge, to his credit, began attending these sessions, not to lecture, but to listen. Occasionally, he'd offer quiet praise. It wasn't just the students who transformed. The academy began to breathe differently. It was less rigid now, less about hierarchy, more about hearing. Naomi never asked for an office. She still preferred the bench in the corner of the practice wing, where students knew to find her if they needed music, advice, or silence. Her cart sat there too, spotless, symbolic, untouched. One afternoon, as Naomi finished helping a student find the right modulation for a piece they were composing, a soft knock sounded at the hallway entrance. It was Isabel Cho. She entered with the grace of someone used to stages, but spoke with the humility of someone who never forgot her own beginnings. I came to see how the roots are growing, she said, smiling. Naomi chuckled. They're stubborn, but strong. Isabel handed her a thick envelope. Inside was a letter, an invitation, and a plane ticket. The World Pianist Guild is honoring you in Vienna this spring, she said. They've asked you to perform, not just as a guest, Naomi, as their keynote artist. Naomi stared at the letter, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or fold it back into silence. I'm not sure I belong on international stages, she said. Isabel placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't just belong, Naomi, you redefine them. That evening, Naomi stayed late at the academy, not to play, but to sit. She walked back into the now familiar auditorium, sat cross-legged on the stage floor, and looked up at the skylight. For a long while, she said nothing. Then, quietly, she began to hum. It was not the lullaby from her youth, not her requiem, not even the triumphant piece she played on recital night. It was something new, unfinished, a seed. Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Lila. Did you write that? She asked. Naomi nodded. It's still becoming. I like it, Lila said. It sounds like a beginning. Naomi smiled. Funny, she said. That's what endings usually are. Lila sat beside her. The two of them watched as the last blush of sunlight filtered through the glass and spilled over the empty seats. Lila looked at her carefully. Do you ever miss the life you could have had? Naomi considered the question. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I remember. I didn't lose the music. I just carried it longer than most before anyone listened. She reached into her pocket and handed Lila a folded sheet. It was the handwritten score of the new piece. I want you to finish it, Naomi said. Lila's eyes widened. Me? It's yours now. Lila clutched it as though it were a crown. The legacy Naomi had buried in silence was no longer hers to protect, it was hers to share. As the last light dimmed, the music hadn't ended. It was multiplying. The rain came softly that morning, veiling the campus in a kind of hush, as though the sky itself knew it should not speak too loudly. Naomi walked beneath it, unhurried, her coat unbuttoned, her head uncovered. She let the droplets fall into her hair and along her face, cleansing her of yesterday, baptizing her into something new. She no longer moved like a ghost among the academy halls. And yet, she hadn't become a spectacle either. Somehow, her presence was now an anchor, steady, known, revered, in quiet ways. Even the building felt different now. The echo in the stairwells no longer sounded hollow. The old floorboards didn't creak like groans, but like a heartbeat. Inside the practice room wing, light filtered through tall windows and dust danced through the air like shimmering notes on a staff. Naomi paused before entering her usual space, her hand grazing the doorframe like one greets an old friend. Through the narrow window she saw a boy, 10, maybe 11, at the upright piano. His shoes were scuffed, his back too rigid, his fingers clumsy with hesitation. But he was trying. He was reaching. She didn't interrupt. Not yet. She waited until he stopped, sighed, and buried his face in his hands. Then she opened the door with the gentlest knock. He looked up, startled. "Too hard?" she asked kindly. He nodded, his eyes glassy. "My fingers don't move fast enough." Naomi walked in slowly. "What piece?" He handed her a tattered page. It was a simplified version of Claire de Lune, notes scribbled in with red ink, fingerings circled 3 times over. "I want to play like the girl who was here yesterday," he murmured. "Lila." Naomi smiled, easing down onto the bench beside him. "She wants to play like you know." The boy looked up, confused. "Why would she want that?" "Because you're still honest," Naomi said. "And honesty makes music beautiful, even when it's slow, especially when it's slow." She reached out and gently guided his fingers back to the keys. "Let's try just the first line," she whispered. Together, note by note, they moved through the phrase. Naomi didn't rush, she didn't correct too much. She let the pauses linger, let the breath come back into the notes. And something shifted. The boy didn't play faster. He played truer. Later that day, in the quiet hour before lunch, Naomi was summoned once more to the headmaster's office. This time, the call came with no tension, only curiosity. When she arrived, the headmaster stood by the window, holding an envelope in one hand and a letter in the other. On the desk lay a folder with gold-embossed lettering, United Nations Cultural Council, Global Artistic Laureates Program. Naomi raised a brow. "They've selected you," the headmaster said, "as a global laureate for artistic resilience and social transformation. They want you to perform at the UN Assembly this fall, in Geneva." Naomi stared. Not in disbelief, not in panic, but in stillness, as though a door had opened that she'd always known was there, even when the world said otherwise. "They'll fly you first class," the headmaster added with a faint smile. "They even offered to upgrade the hotel if you prefer something with a piano in the suite." Naomi let out a soft, breathy laugh. "The only thing I've ever flown is a mop across a marble floor." "Now you'll fly the flag of every person who's ever been overlooked," the headmaster said. Naomi placed her hand on the folder, then looked up. "I don't need a title," she said gently, "but if my playing can make someone listen harder, see further, feel deeper, then yes, I'll go." When word spread across the academy, cheers erupted. Students hung signs in the hallways, hand-drawn tributes filled with musical notes and phrases like "Naomi, our maestro," and "From mop to master." Someone taped a golden star to her old cleaning cart. It wasn't mockery. It was a monument. That evening, Naomi sat in the back row of the recital hall as Lila performed her composition for the first time. It was imperfect. It was powerful. It began with hesitant steps, like a child walking barefoot through wet grass. But by the second page, it rose with conviction. Naomi recognized her own melody, barely, but woven in new colors, stretched in new directions, reshaped with youthful courage. Lila stood after the final note, eyes wide, heart thudding. The room fell silent. Then Naomi rose. She didn't clap. She simply said, "It's time we recorded that." The next day, Lila entered a studio for the first time. Naomi sat behind the glass, headphones wrapped around her ears, watching every movement. She didn't instruct. She didn't critique. She witnessed. When Lila finished the final take, Naomi walked into the room. "That wasn't just music," she whispered. "That was a story only you could tell." The recording went online under the title, Legacy, a Duet Without Words, Lila Carter, inspired by Naomi Williams. Within hours, it trended. Within days, it traveled, across continents, across language, across hearts. Soon, other students began composing pieces named for those who had lifted them. Single mothers, cousins, school lunch aides, neighbors. A movement began, not with noise but with notes. Each one whispered the same message, "I see you now." The world didn't just applaud Naomi anymore, they echoed her. In corners of cities, children who had never touched a piano asked for keyboards. In old churches, janitors began to play after Sunday service. In community centers, retired musicians came out of hiding. Naomi's story cracked open something far bigger than one woman's redemption. It reminded the world that greatness doesn't always come wrapped in degrees and press releases. Sometimes it comes in quiet, sometimes in humility, sometimes in a woman with aching hands and a heart full of symphonies. The first time Naomi set foot on European soil, she stood on the tarmac for a full minute, not moving, not speaking, just feeling. The wind smelled different, the sky somehow wider. And the hush of Geneva was not the hush of silence, but the hush of reverence, of poised diplomacy, as though every word here had weight, and every footstep was part of history's choreography. A sleek black car waited to take her to the hotel. Her name, Naomi Williams, was printed in gold on a placard. It shimmered through the window like a dream that refused to dissolve. The driver held open the door and said, "Welcome, Miss Williams." She blinked, almost expecting him to correct himself and say ma'am or madam. But he didn't, because the world had changed. And so had she. The suite overlooked Lake Geneva, its waters calm, unshaken by the stirring city around it. A Steinway stood in the center of the room, its lid half open, polished like obsidian. Naomi's hand trembled slightly as she lifted the fallboard and touched the keys. She didn't play. Not yet. She just closed her eyes and rested her fingers on the ivory as if checking a pulse. The piano didn't breathe, but she did. For the performance, they gave her a blue silk gown and a silver pin in the shape of a treble clef. It sparkled at her collar like starlight. Her hair, now salt and pepper in elegant coils, was styled by a woman who had once dressed royalty. But Naomi kept her own shoes, scuffed black flats that had walked too many miles to be left behind. Backstage, she stood alone, no cameras, no applause yet, just stillness. Outside those doors, representatives from every nation waited. Diplomats, delegates, translators. But Naomi didn't see power. She saw people. She saw ears waiting to listen. When the announcer called her name, there was a moment of surprised murmuring. The audience had read the pamphlet. But few expected her, until she walked out. Then no one questioned, because her presence carried something even the most fluent speaker could not translate. Truth. She walked to the piano like it was sacred. She bowed, not as a performer, but as a guest invited into the hearts of strangers. Then she sat and silence swallowed the room. Naomi didn't play her old piece, nor Lila's, nor the triumphant one from the Academy recital. She played the new one, the one that had started as a hum in the rain, the one she had composed after watching children create music with broken tools and unbreakable spirits, the one called For the Unseen. The melody began soft, so soft that the diplomats had to lean in. It sounded like footsteps on bare concrete, like whispered lullabies in one-room homes, like the long, aching pause between hope and disappointment. But then it grew. It bloomed. Strings of melody wrapped around each other like roots beneath the surface, unseen but holding up entire forests. She layered in notes like voices, some shrill with pain, some trembling with awe. The dynamics swelled not with arrogance, but with the urgency of someone who had waited her whole life to say something that mattered. And now, finally, the world listened. At the crescendo, her hands blurred, not from speed but from depth. Every note hit like a truth too long buried. Every silence between notes felt like a name remembered. By the final chord, no one moved. No rustle of suits, no clearing of throats. Just breath, just awe, and then applause. Not out of obligation, out of surrender. Delegates rose. Ambassadors wiped their eyes. Translators forgot their devices. And in the midst of it, Naomi stood and bowed once. She had not performed. She had confessed. That night, Naomi walked along the lake alone, the cold air stinging her cheeks, the world vast and familiar in a new way. She sat on a bench, pulled her coat tighter, and looked up at the stars. And for the first time in her life, she wept not from loss, but from fullness. Back home, the Naomi Williams initiative now spanned 4 academies. Her story had been adapted into children's books, a short documentary, and a performance series called Unsung Keys. Each episode featured a hidden artist, custodians, immigrants, veterans, street performers, given a piano and a platform. But Naomi didn't bask in any of it. She returned to the academy quietly one winter morning, her boots caked with salt and snow. The students were rehearsing for the winter concert. Lila stood in the center, conducting her own composition now, The Echo Learns to Speak. Naomi watched from the doorway. When the final chord resolved, Lila turned, beaming. "I saved a seat for you," she said. Naomi smiled. "I'm not sitting," she replied. voice low, warm. "I'm listening." Later that day, Naomi returned to the old bench beside the practice hall window, the one where she used to rest during mopping breaks, staring out at the courtyard and wondering if music still lived inside her. Now, children passed by, humming her melodies. Teachers stopped to ask for her opinion. Even the youngest students ran to show her their practice notebooks. And still, she never demanded recognition. She simply gave what she had always given: music. And in giving, she rewrote every silence the world had ever handed her. The wind moved gently through the courtyard, curling around the stone arches of the academy like a memory coming home. It was early spring now, the air laced with the scent of rain-drenched blossoms and something softer still: hope. Naomi sat alone on the piano bench in the recital hall, long before rehearsals began, before voices echoed through the corridors and instruments filled the air with expectation. The room was still, not silent but still, like the breath before a song begins. Her fingers floated above the keys without pressing them, not out of fear or hesitation, but reverence. They hovered like a priest's hands before a blessing, like the final moment before a bird takes flight. She didn't need to play right now. Not for the world, not even for herself. She just needed to feel the piano's nearness, the wood, the cool of the keys. Her oldest friend. 10 years had passed, 10 full years since the night the world finally listened. And so much had changed. The Naomi Williams initiative had grown beyond anyone's imagination. Not just a program now, it was a movement. A global collective of artists who had once been silenced, dismissed, underestimated. They called themselves the Second Verse. There were children in refugee camps composing on tablet screens, grandmothers in Brazil learning cello, a street pianist in Detroit whose blindfolded performances brought entire sidewalks to tears. Their stories had formed a constellation of resilience, and at the center of it, like a pulse, was Naomi. She hadn't performed publicly in years, not because she couldn't, but because she had given her stage away. She had passed it, piece by piece, to the next hands, the ones still trembling, the ones still waiting. Today, the Academy was holding a special ceremony, a rededication. One of the main performance halls, once named after a long-forgotten donor, was being renamed the Naomi Williams Conservatory Hall. She hadn't asked for that. In truth, she'd hesitated when the board approached her. She didn't care for titles or marble plaques, but then she thought of the girl who might see that name etched above the door and dare to believe her own music mattered. That girl deserved a sign. And so, she had agreed. But she insisted on one thing: no speeches. Only music. She would not talk about where she came from, or how many years she spent cleaning floors beneath the feet of men who never looked down. She would not describe the ache in her wrist from the accident that nearly ended her playing. She wouldn't recount the humiliation of being told she wasn't allowed to touch the piano. She'd already said everything she needed to say. In melody, in silence, in truth. The students began to file in now, dressed in every shade of hope. Blue ties, red dresses, braids, scars, calluses, joy. The room filled not with ceremony, but with affection. Lila walked toward Naomi first. Now in her mid-20s, Lila had become a full-time composer and one of the youngest instructors at the academy. She knelt beside the bench and smiled. "You ready?" she whispered. Naomi nodded, her eyes shimmering. Lila reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded, yellowed sheet of music. "I kept this," she said. "All these years." It was the handwritten score Naomi had given her on the night the rain fell like a hymn. She smoothed it out across the music stand and stepped away. Naomi didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the cameras, or the board members seated in front, or the mural on the wall that now bore her likeness in soft, sweeping strokes. She looked at the keys, and she began. This wasn't a performance. It was a reminder, a final love letter. A whispered thank you to the girl she used to be. The piece was simple. No grand crescendo, no furious trills, just quiet beauty. Notes that rose like breath, rested like memory, and resolved like peace. It was the kind of music that didn't shout, but lingered. As she played, faces blurred in her vision, not because of age, or tears, or light, but because her soul had shifted into the notes. She wasn't playing anymore. She was the song. And when the final chord came, she let it hang. No bow, no flourish. She stood. Her fingers rested on the closed lid for a moment, then fell gently to her side. The room erupted, not in noise but in stillness, that electric stillness, the kind that vibrates in the heart. Then a single student in the back rose and began to play. Not her piece, their own, a small melody, raw, honest. Then another joined, and another. Soon the recital hall was filled with layers, imperfect but beautiful. The music of many, a song of legacy. Naomi stepped down and walked slowly to the back of the hall. She didn't need the stage anymore. She had already given it away. Outside, under the soft canopy of blooming trees, a child sat at a garden piano, an outdoor installation created in Naomi's honor. His hands were too small to reach an octave, but he played anyway, a small tune, simple. Curious. Naomi sat beside him. "Do you like it?" he asked, not knowing who she was. She smiled. "I love it." "You looked up, too?" She looked down at her hands, now older, etched with time and meaning. "I used to," she said. "Why'd you stop?" She paused. "So you could start." He didn't quite understand, but he nodded, like children do when they sense something sacred. She placed her hand over his, guiding him to the next chord. And in that small garden, surrounded by trees and wind and echoes, Naomi played once more. Not alone, not for the world, but with it. A harmony that would never stop, because music, when given freely, never ends. It only changes hands. Sometimes the greatest symphonies are composed in silence, not on stages, but in lives spent in the shadows, waiting, enduring, and quietly believing in more. Naomi Williams spent decades invisible. A janitor, a woman who cleaned after the world had performed and left. Every day she walked the halls of a prestigious music academy, not as a guest, not as a student, but as a ghost in overalls, pushing a mop while masterpieces echoed around her. But inside her hands, calloused by labor, lived music the world had forgotten how to hear. And when her chance finally came, she didn't take the stage to prove anyone wrong. She took it to remember who she really was. Naomi's story is not just about talent. It's about time, about patience, about the quiet fire that burns in people long ignored. It's a story for anyone who's ever been told to know their place, for anyone who had a dream but set it aside so they could survive, for anyone who's ever asked, "Is it too late for me?" The answer is no. It is never too late to be seen. It is never too late to be heard. This story teaches us that our worth is not diminished by how the world labels us. The world called Naomi a cleaner, but music called her composer. They told her to stick to the floors, but her heart had already soared above stages they couldn't even imagine. We all carry songs inside us, truths, talents, and beauty waiting for the right moment to rise. And the world needs your voice, not the polished version, not the perfect version, but the honest one, the one shaped by your journey. Because someone out there needs to hear you. Just like the world needed to hear Naomi. Never stop creating. Never stop reaching. Even if the spotlight doesn't find you right away, stay ready. Because when it does, let it find you at the piano of your purpose, fingers trembling but unafraid.